It's now my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Australia's Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi. She's going to speak to us on a related topic. Senator Faruqi assumed her role as Greens Senator for New South Wales in 2018, following a 25-year career as a professional engineer and academic. She now holds several portfolios, including international aid and development, housing, industry and education. Senator Faruqi has been a champion for women's empowerment and equality, climate justice and environmental protection. Senator Faruqi is the Australian Greens International Development spokesperson. Can you join me in warmly welcoming her?
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. We are gathered today on stolen land. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we gathered on, the Bejigal and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And as we face the intimately linked crisis of climate change and rampant capitalism, we must work for a world that is free from injustice, a world where the well-being of people isn't predicated on endless, unsustainable, planet-destroying economic growth. A world where building a just and decent life for all of us is a possibility and becomes a reality. To do that, we must be devoted to working alongside First Nations people in their fight for justice, in their fight for treaties, and in their fight for self-determination. It is a real privilege to be here today. I spent 14 years at UNSW, either as a student or as a teacher, so it is a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And thank you so much for the incredible work that you all do in making this world a much better place. Now, we've just heard from the Right Honourable Eneli Sopoaga, who has long been a climate champion in the Pacific, and has been instrumental, I believe, in putting issues faced by people in places like Tuvalu front and center of the international debate on climate action. And I am a real admirer of yours, Mr. Sopoaga. And you know, what you do is a really bold and brave and courageous move. And I feel that if we have any hope of addressing the climate emergency, we've all got to be braver and bolder. So today, I want us to reimagine international development and foreign aid, not simply as charity, but as an issue of global justice, not as a way to further our own national ambitions, but as a way to right historic wrongs, not as a way to further our greedy trade interests, but as a way to build communities in parts of the world that have been left destitute. In recent times, Australian aid has shrunk by dramatic proportions. No one knows that better than all of you. Spending on aid has fallen to historic lows under the coalition government. They've slashed the aid budget by $11.8 billion in just 6 years, leaving just around 0.2% of our gross national income for international development. That is a far cry from the United Nations target of 0.7% of our GNI. And I know how your work gets so impacted with every single cut to the aid budget. Australia has an obligation to contribute to a just and equitable world by working with communities in the Global South to promote human rights, environmental protection, health, education, and climate justice. Australia has an obligation, particularly as a wealthy country, and given its colonial past, to encourage positive and equitable change in social, economic, and environmental justice across the world. But the quantity of aid isn't the only question here. What is the point of a $10 billion aid program if it just feathers the nests of private companies, for instance? Transformative change does require resources, but most importantly, it requires the courage to set new rules. So when I ask you to reimagine aid as something greater than charity, I mean that we tackle the underlying root causes of inequality and the imbalance of power by recognizing, first of all, that we live in a fundamentally unjust world. A world where the global north has long had colonial and extractive relationships with the global south. A world where inequality between people living in different parts of the globe is one of the most urgent emergencies facing humanity. A world in which where you are born decides more of what your life will be than any other circumstance like ability or potential. Millions of children's futures are stolen from them the moment they are born, as our passports, our nationalities, and places of birth determine our futures. A world where many international conflicts and humanitarian disasters owe their genesis to arbitrary lines on the map drawn by colonialists in London, Paris, or Washington. This is a grave injustice, but we must remember that inequality is not a natural phenomenon. Poverty is not an accident. I'm inspired by the words of Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano, who says, "Poverty is not written in the stars. Underdevelopment is not one of God's mysterious designs." So it is time to abandon old assumptions, see clearly the gravity of what we are facing, and rethink the way we look at aid and international development. Poverty in the global south is a result of colonization and the ongoing legacy of colonialism through the continued extraction of resources and the grossly unfair neoliberal trade and debt systems. In parts of the world, colonialism has merely reformed into extractive and exploitative global corporations. Arundhati Roy has called these the economic outposts of the empire. Let's take, for example, Guinea. The small nation in West Africa is rich with mineral wealth, boasting perhaps the largest bauxite reserves in the world, yet its people live in extreme poverty and have reaped no benefit from these riches whatsoever, because Western corporations have negotiated so-called contracts that funnel all the wealth to them. Some of these corporations have been investigated for bribery to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, bribery that has yet again stolen so many futures. Or take India, where research by the economist Utsa Patnaik from Columbia University that draws upon nearly 2 centuries of detailed data on tax and trade and concludes that Britain drained a total of $45 trillion from the subcontinent during the period 1765 to 1938. To put that in perspective, it is 17 times more than the total annual gross domestic product of the United Kingdom today. In Australian terms, that is 34 times the size of the total Australian economy. This extraction of wealth is not just a historic problem, but an ongoing one, and that's the reason I'm talking about it now. A report by the US-based Global Financial Integrity and the Center of Applied Research at the Norwegian School of Economics published some shocking numbers on this flight of capital, finding that poor countries are in fact still net creditors to the rich countries in the global north. The majority of tax havens in the world are controlled by Western countries, where trillions of dollars of stolen money from developing countries have ended up. These are actively protected by systems in place precisely to keep the money there. These systems have played a vital role in enabling corruption that has undermined democracy and human rights. We know illegal capital flight wouldn't be possible without these tax havens. After all, where would you hide the money if there was nowhere for it to disappear? I can't even bear to think of the social costs of all of this, but there are people around the world who are bearing those costs. This is money that should have been used to provide education, to build hospitals, to improve gender equality, and provide resilience to climate change. or in other words, provide the future, dignity, and opportunity that everyone deserves. Although aid makes about 1% of our budget, it has accounted for 25% of all budget cuts announced by the government since 2013. I mean, that is pretty shameful. So to be realistic about the aid project is to be realistic about the global picture of inequality and the power imbalance that exists. Too often, our aid programs have been used to subsidize Australian business. Particularly in the last few years, we've seen business come to the forefront of the aid program at the expense of genuine partnership and with recipient communities, and with little accountability and transparency. There is no aid without partnership. Australian aid programs must recognize the strengths, capabilities, and knowledge of partner communities, of partner countries, of the amazing local knowledge that exists in those communities. The delivery of aid should also be a decolonizing process. And if it's not, then it's very shallow. Many of you here know that communities are very easily able to identify the problems that they face by themselves. Our role in working with them to remove barriers to their own self-determination is the most important one. And in doing so, we must commit to Australian aid projects recognizing the rights of Indigenous communities to free, prior, and informed consent as recognized in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Too often, Indigenous communities are overlooked in the delivery of aid, and this cannot continue. The climate emergency, in particular, looms large in the landscape of global inequality. And given Australia's, and I'll say it, given Australia's dirty hands in producing climate-changing emissions, we have a special responsibility to do everything we can for climate justice. The longer we wait, the greater the loss of life and the greater the threat to the world as we know it. We are witnesses to an intergenerational theft that will deprive future generations the opportunity to make a dignified life. We are witnesses to a global theft of epic proportions, where countries least responsible for the climate crisis are amongst the worst affected. The reality is that coal is the biggest contributor to climate change, and Australia is the biggest exporter of coal. Our neighbors in the Pacific Islands, as you've heard, have water lapping at their doorsteps. They have been calling on Australia to wean off our addiction to fossil fuels. But our big political parties are firmly in the pockets of big coal, oil, and gas. Climate breakdown is an existential threat to our neighbors and must be front and center of our foreign aid and international development program. Those who contributed least to the climate emergency we face are often the hardest hit by rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and environmental damage. In Pakistan, the country that I grew up, 2 entire villages were swept away by melting glaciers just last year. It is also forecast as one of the countries to be the hardest hit. I know that women and girls there have to travel further and further to collect water and fuel because of climate change. And to do that, they have to forego study and wages so that they can survive. Leaders from these countries have been pleading with the big polluters in the global north, like us, to make a change, to stop this mantra of unlimited economic expansion, at the heart of which is a callous disregard for our environment and climate. Australia must also provide climate reparations to affected countries and communities, commensurate with its historical and ongoing contribution to the problem. Our aid program must recognize the unique challenges faced by women and girls in this climate emergency. The climate injustice gap between the global north and south has become a chasm, which will drive a further wedge between those who can afford to adapt to a destroying world and those who are left to bear the brunt of the climate meltdown. So Australia must show responsibility and shore up aid which is commensurate with our historic and ongoing contribution to this climate crisis. We must genuinely collaborate with communities as equal partners through the promotion of local ownership, participation, and delivery of aid programs. And Australia must look beyond its borders, not as a nation hungry for resources and cheap goods, not as a nation suspicious or fearful of others, and not as an ally of a war machine, but as a friend of people who are fighting oppression, who are fighting marginalization, and who are fighting injustices, wherever they might be. We must become a strong proponent of democracy and human rights everywhere, not just where it's politically expedient. As Angela Davis says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And you have to do it all the time. Thank you for being the people who do it all the time. Yeah, sure.
Well, that was, I must say, I did feel a little bit nervous on your behalf when you were following the Right Honourable NLOP, because I thought that was a very hard act to follow, but I think you've certainly, from an Australian perspective, spoken about our responsibilities. You've reminded us that climate action is not charity, it's actually part of global justice. And you've spoken powerfully about our obligations and responsibilities, and I thank you for that.